All right, thank you everyone for coming to today's talk. We're going to be hearing from soon-to-be Dr. Linda Zhang, who is finishing up her graduate work at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor under Dr. Christopher Monk. Her research examines the impact of contextual experiences, such as early life adversity and neighborhood opportunity, on brain development, executive function, and mental health outcomes by using computational methods, including computational models of cognition and person-specific neural network mapping. She's going to be talking to us today about her work that comprises her dissertation, which is Neurocognitive Development and Context, Longitudinal Insights from Computational Modeling and Person-Specific Methods. So please join me in welcoming Linda to CBI. So, hi, in the back, you can hear me okay? Yeah, okay, all right. Yeah, thank you very much for that kind introduction. My name is Linda. I'm currently a fifth-year PhD candidate at the University of Michigan in developmental psychology. Yeah, so I'm very excited to be here today to be able to share some of my graduate work with everyone. It's quite an upgrade from the cold winter weather in Michigan, so I definitely very much appreciate the invite. I do have content prepared for around 35 to 40 minutes, so we'll have some time at the end for questions, but if there's any like burning clarifying questions in the middle, just raise your hand and I'm happy to take that as well. All right, so here's a brief outline for today's talk. I'll start by telling you a little bit about my research interests broadly, and then I'll talk about two different lines of projects that I've been working on. And I'll end with some future directions that I'm really excited to head in. So what do I study? At the broad level, I'm really interested in understanding neurocognitive development, how that is shaped by the context that we grow up in, and the implications for mental health outcomes. So I'm interested in understanding cognition in development, particularly executive functions, and using behavioral tasks and computational models of cognition to characterize that. And my interest in executive functioning really started when I was an undergraduate at Brown University, where I worked in Dr. Amitai Shenhav's lab and learned about motivation-driven cognitive control and decision-making. So I completed my honors thesis on how expected challenge levels and reward levels impact how much people are willing to exert cognitive effort, and also how people have felt while doing so. So we published this work in the Journal of Cogneuro in 2024. So if you're interested in that, definitely go and read our paper. And from here, my interest in looking at executive function and using task performance to evaluate that only grew. And in my graduate work, I employ computational model of cognition to study EF in development, particularly in adolescents and young adults. I'm also really interested in understanding the brain, how it develops, how it supports cognition. And in my graduate work, I've mostly focused on looking at functional connectivity using fMRI methods. And the final piece to this is that I want to understand how the environment that we grow up in can shape cognitive functioning and the brain, and also the relationship with mental health outcomes. And so my work is in part driven by frameworks such as the biopsychosocial system of development, which I know is too small to see right here. But models such as these emphasizes that the overlapping biological and psychological aspects within a person interacts with and is also impacted by the surrounding environment that we grow up in. And this makes it really important to study questions like how do our experiences with those environments impact our executive functioning and our brains as a mechanism towards impacting our mental health, and do these different experiences explain the individual differences that we can see in neurocognition. So driven by these questions, my dissertation research focuses mostly on the socioeconomic context, which we all know is incredibly multifaceted. And so in my dissertation, I examine the context from several different aspects. I look at disadvantage as well as opportunities in the environment. And I also study this at the family and also at the neighborhood. I also approach these questions from a longitudinal perspective, focusing on how earlier experiences may shape later outcomes. And the projects that I'll be sharing with you today really center on adolescence as a key developmental period. And this is one that is marked by a continued maturation of executive functioning and the underlying brain mechanisms. At the same time, we know that adolescents are navigating this increasing independence and shifting social context, making this a particularly sensitive window where contextual influences can have long lasting. And with that, I want to first share some work coming from my dissertation research, which I really tried to integrate a lot of the things that I just talked about to examine how the socioeconomic context may shape neurocognitive development. And this first project that I'll share with you applies the drift diffusion model in examining how a specific aspect of childhood socioeconomic disadvantage, namely material hardship, impact adolescent executive functioning. And this manuscript is currently undergoing minor revision at Developmental Science as part of a special issue on computing development. So if anyone wants to learn more about this project after, I'm happy to send you a working draft of the manuscript. And I also want to mention that this project was especially in collaboration with Dr. Alex Weigard at psychiatry at the University of Michigan, and Dr. Felicia Hardy, who is now a postdoctoral. All right, so a little bit of background to get us situated. We know that poverty is a widespread issue in the US with very important psychological consequences. So traditional approaches to studying poverty has oftentimes used income-based indicators such as family level income or household poverty ratio. On the other hand, we have a more relatively understudied dimension of poverty, which is material hardship. And this is measuring difficulties with housing, food, utilities, medical bills, and is really a much more direct way to assess the concrete struggles that are faced by families on a day-to-day basis. So in this study, I wanted to understand how exposure to material hardship throughout childhood can impact executive functioning in adolescence, specifically measuring executive functioning with a behavioral task. And some existing evidence has linked early exposure to poverty broadly and also to specific challenges like food insecurity and overcrowding of housing to lower cognitive performance, as well as an increased risk for attentional problems in children and adolescents. But several limitations do exist. One is that research on material hardship remains fairly limited, especially with regards to understanding attention problems and the underlying cognitive mechanisms. And also fairly few studies have examined the longitudinal impacts of material hardship on cognitive outcomes. And also, criticisms have come up regarding the conventional use of average response time and accuracy as the sole proxy for cognitive functioning from behavioral tasks. And this includes issues such as test-retest reliability, as well as the idea that these broader level measures are quote unquote black boxes that can also capture some irrelevant processes besides whatever is your cognitive ability of interest. And so one path forward to a more precise way of characterizing executive functioning through behavioral tasks is the application of computational models of cognition. And here I will talk specifically about the diffusion decision model, also known as the drift diffusion model, or DDM for short. So just a very brief kind of introduction to the DDM. It is essentially a set of mathematical descriptions of cognitive processes underlying observed behavior. It is a pretty well-established model that has been used in cognitive psychology to explain how people make simple two-choice decisions. So in this particular study, I am applying it on a very simple decision-making task where we show participants a face and we ask them to tell us if this was a male or female face. And here I'm showing you an example timeline for the length of one trial. The DDM assumes that in this decision process, individuals will continuously gather evidence for both of the options until they reach a decision threshold at the top or the bottom boundary. And in this example, the top boundary represents the choice for female, and the bottom boundary represents the choice for male. And these squiggly lines that you're seeing in the background here represents the estimated decision process for where one squiggly line is essentially the estimated process for one trial. And in this decision process, the model takes in trial-wise reaction time and accuracy data and estimates a bunch of different parameters. And for this study, I focused specifically on the drift rate parameter, which we characterize as, or which we conceptualize as being driven by the efficiency of evidence accumulation, or EEA for short. So EEA is essentially the rate of how efficient someone is at gathering information to make a relevant decision. And it has been hypothesized to explain individual differences in cognitive task performance across a wide variety of tasks. It's shown superior psychometric properties compared with average reaction time and accuracy, including better internal consistency and test-retest reliability. And it's also been linked with broad psychopathology, including externalizing and internalizing behavior, which really helps showcase its potential clinical activity. And so for this study, I investigated how material hardship exposure during childhood can impact adolescent executive functioning as indexed by EEA. And I also wanted to examine the links with adolescent attention problems. Specifically, does EEA serve as a potential underlying mechanism linking material hardship and attentional problems in adolescents? So now I'll tell you a little bit about the sample that I work with. So the study sample comes from the larger Future Families and Child Wellbeing Study, which is a large-scale birth cohort study that started around at the end of the millennium. So the FFCWS oversampled for non-marital births in 20 large US cities, resulting in a greater proportion of single-parent households. Now, these kids and their families, mostly their primary caregivers, were tracked from birth through age 22, and I believe their age 27 wave is just getting started. Now, when these kids were at the year 15 wave, the study of adolescent to adult neurodevelopment, or the SAND study, recruited a subset of the sample to the University of Michigan, where they participated in completing questionnaires, clinical interviews, behavioral tasks, and MRI scans, among some other things. Now, the SAND subsample was drawn from neighboring areas to the University of Michigan, so primarily from Detroit and also from some from Toledo, Ohio, and Chicago. And this sample notably is also enriched with mostly Black individuals who have traditionally been underrepresented in developmental science research. And both of the projects that I'll be presenting today focus on data coming out of the SAND 15 subsample, and they're all secondary data. All right, so for this project specifically, I use data that comes from both the SAND sub-study as well as longitudinally from the previous Future of Families waves. So our primary measure of poverty, namely material hardship, is measured with parent report items of hardship experiences in the last 12 months of when they had participated in the study. So I computed sum scores of the 8 items that were repeated across waves at ages 1, 3, 5, and 9, as well as a cumulative sum score across all EA, which is our measure of executive functioning, was measured at year 15 and was estimated using an R package for DDM. Happy to talk more in detail about the modeling process later if anyone's curious. So the data comes from that FACES decision-making test that I talked about, which has roughly 100 trials per person. So one thing to note is that for this task, there are several different emotional phases that were presented to the participants. But for the purpose of this study, I'm really only focusing on the decision-making aspect of it. But we did do some sensitivity analyses with the emotions that I'm also happy to share the details. And our measure of adolescent attention problems was characterized using a latent factor with items from the parent report CBCL and the semi-structured clinical interview of KSATS PL. All right, so now for some results. I first looked at whether cumulative material hardship from ages 1 through 9 predicted adolescent EEA in a regression analysis. And what I found is that greater exposure to material hardship throughout childhood predicted lower EEA, suggesting that early hardship experience may hinder how effectively individuals are able to use, process, and use information to make decisions. So in all of our analyses, we also adjusted for a set of a priori planned covariates, and this includes other adverse experiences such as violence exposure and social deprivation at ages 3, 5, and 9. These are types of adversities that have been examined in the literature as factors that may impact executive functioning in development. We also adjust for a set of demographic covariates, and all of this is really to help us distinguish the effects of material hardship specifically. So now that we know about the effects of cumulative material hardship, I also wanted to know about how it changed across time and how that may impact EEA. So I conducted a growth curve analysis using the sum score of material hardship at each of the ages 1, 3, 5, and 9. I then extracted the slope and intercept and looked at the association with EEA. So what I found is that the intercept, but not the slope, was significantly associated with EEA, such that the initial level of material hardship, rather than changes in hardship over time, had a stronger negative impact on adolescent. We also looked at adolescent attention problems with an indirect effects model. So we did see a significant link between adolescent EEA and concurrent attention problems, such that less efficient information processing is associated with greater attention problems in adolescents. And this is very consistent with past literature. We also observed a very small indirect effect of hardship experience on adolescent attention problems through EEA, such that EEA partially explained this association. But as you can tell, like the effect is very small and very borderline, so we're not making too big a deal out of this. And finally, I also wanted to mention that all of the findings that I just talked about were specific to EEA and were not evident with average reaction time and accuracy. So we didn't see any significant association with either material hardship or attention problems in adolescents. And what this may suggest is that, at least in this study, EEA can really help reveal specific cognitive mechanisms that would otherwise, and also the relations with adversity and attention problems that would otherwise not have been detected if we were only looking at average reaction time and accuracy. But of course, this line of work is kind of just getting started and more needs to be done to be able to generalize. So to kind of summarize, this is one of the first studies to really look at how socioeconomic factors may impact EEA. We found that greater cumulative childhood material hardship beyond experiences of other types of adversity problems is associated with lower EEA, which in turn is linked with greater attention problems in adolescents. So that's kind of the first project that I wanted to share about in detail. So beyond factors at the family level environment, I'm also curious about the socioeconomic factors at a broader ecological context. And indeed, the neighborhood where children live in or grow up in also matters a lot for their neurocognitive development. And this may be particularly salient, especially starting in adolescence, where or when they kind of gain more independence and interact with more with the environments outside of their family home. So how does this impact EEA? This is something that I'm currently working on with the second chapter of my dissertation. And here I work with kind of the same larger future family sample, but instead now turning my focus to the young adult neurocognition using data coming out of our newest SAN21 wave, which is a slightly larger cohort compared with the adolescent wave, coming from a more diverse range of cities in the US. We estimated young adult EEA with the same task that was completed at age 15. And here I'm looking at adolescent neighborhood opportunity using a census tract level composite score from the Child Opportunity Index, which is actually an open source data set from diversitydatakits.org that you can just go online and download. So the latest version of the COI includes 44 different indicators across 3 domains of neighborhood opportunity, and this includes education resources, health and environment, as well as social and economic. So this is still kind of a work in progress, but preliminary analyses show that the overall neighborhood opportunity during adolescence does significantly predict EA in young adulthood, specifically that higher neighborhood opportunity predicts higher EEA in young adults. And I see similar results when looking at specific dimensions of neighborhood opportunity with some slight differences, such that the health and environment domain, which is in the middle here, and the social and economic domain on the right here, have somewhat stronger links with young adult EEA compared with the education dimension. This is pretty cool considering that we have about a 7 to 8 year gap between the adolescent neighborhood level measure and the young adult cognition measure, which may indicate some strong longitudinal effects there. And as a next step, I'm looking to explore whether these effects interact with family level populations. I'm now realizing that my dark background is not showing up very well on this projector. It's a cool brain image, so just imagine that. All right, so I now want to shift gears from that longitudinal contextual effect a little bit. I'm also very interested in understanding functional brain networks using functional MRI and how they may adapt in the short term. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this other project that I am just starting to write up as a manuscript, examining how individual differences in functional connectivity patterns may exist when looking at resting versus task-based connectivity. I'll only talk about a subset of the analyses coming out of the paper for the sake of time, but I'm happy to discuss the other parts too. I also wanted to mention that this project was done under the guidance of Dr. Adrian Beltz, and I want to acknowledge Neurocognitive and Savannah Michaud in our lab for their help with data and analysis. All right, so functional connectivity, as I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, is one measure of brain activity that gets at how different regions in the brain are communicating with each other and working together. So at its core, it's simply the correlation between time series data coming from functional bolts MRI signals. And these connectivity patterns have been grouped into large-scale brain networks that's since been examined widely in the context of understanding individual differences in behavior and outcomes. So a lot of studies have demonstrated that there is this incredible amount of variability in functional connectivity patterns And the existence of such variability is very important because it suggests that these properties could really be informative in understanding brain mechanisms, underlying traits, behavior, mental health outcomes, etc. But before we can even get to linking brain with behavior, we need to actually understand what it is that we are measuring. So functional connectivity is traditionally characterized using data coming out of resting state fMRI, where participants are asked to stare at a fixation cross or just not really do anything in some sort of ways. This is great because it measures this kind of baseline activity that happens in the brain. But also at the same time, it is incredibly unconstrained and might not be able to capture all the existing individual variability that is there. So in more recent years, studies have emerged using task-based MRI to look at functional connectivity as well, where some studies are suggesting that it could provide a more stable, generalizable, and meaningful relationship with behavior and psychopathology symptoms. But do they result in the same or different connectivity patterns? So that's the question that I set out to answer with this project. How do conditions of scanning, namely task versus resting state, impact functional connectivity patterns, and how we understand the individual variability that's associated with connectivity? So the current literature kind of has evidence on both sides for whether task and rest capture the same functional connectivity patterns. So some say yes, that rest and task capture the same variability and general functional architecture and connectivity, that individual differences might also be largely stable across task and rest to a degree that we can identify individuals from a group of participants. On the other hand, there's also a lot of evidence suggesting that connectivity is very much dependent on the state that participants are in, that there are significant task-induced changes, so it matters a lot if we're looking at task or rest. So to really be able to investigate this question and capture individual differences in connectivity, functional connectivity, I applied GIMI, or Group Iterative Multiple Model Estimation, to estimate the functional connectivity pattern. So what is GIMI? GIMI is a data-driven method, meaning that there is no pre-assumed structure to the connectivity data, and that functional connectivity paths are only estimated if they improve fit for a particular model. This results in what we call a sparse network, where each of the connectivity paths that is estimated is meaningfully contributing to the network model, instead of that typical functional connectivity matrix that you would normally see, where connectivity paths are being estimated from every single region to every other. GIMI is also person-specific, meaning that each individual will end up with their own personalized network that best fits their own data. And here I'm showing you some examples for networks that's coming out of the data set that I work with. And you can see that even though there may be some shared similarities across these graphs, every person has a pretty distinct set of patterns that best explains their own data. So by using GIMI to estimate functional connectivity, we're really able to get at that unique and meaningful information from the fMRI data that would typically be obscured when averaging across time series or across people. Now, one limitation of GIMI is that we can only conduct ROI-based investigations, so we can't really do this at the whole brain level. So I selected specific regions of interest from networks that are that were of the greatest relevance, which is the triple network or tripartite network framework that's been implicated broadly in psychopathology. And the three networks, as the name suggests, included here is the central executive or frontal parietal network that's been linked with higher order cognitive functioning. There's the salience network, which is relevant for integrating relevant information, detecting important environmental cues, as well as the default mode network for self-referential mental processes. Now, each of these networks or connectivity patterns from each of these networks have been associated with normal and abnormal functioning in psychopathology in different domains. And we selected 6 ROIs per network, resulting in an 18 ROI network. So in terms of the analyses, I'm working with fMRI data coming out of that same SAND-15 adolescent wave, now limited to those who have completed fMRI scans with good quality data on the relevant scans. And the task that we're comparing to resting is that same faces task that I just talked about in the previous studies. So one gimme network is estimated for each scan per person. So each individual will essentially have 2 gimme networks total. And we compare these networks by looking at several different network metrics that really helps us effectively summarize the networks at different levels of comparisons. So we look at network complexity, which is the total number of paths estimated in a network. Now, if you recall, this is a sparse network, so the total number of paths that are estimated does differ between individuals. We also look at network density, which is the number of paths within or between a network divided by complexity. So it's really a measure of what proportion of the total network is being contributed to by a particular subnetwork. And we have these for both within and between them. And finally, we have node centrality, which is the number of paths coming in or out of a node divided again by complexity, and it's also a proportional measure of essentially the significance of a particular ROI in this network. And there is one metric per region of interest. All right, so some interesting results. So I compared these networks using multi-level modeling with scan conditions set as the random effect. And what I found is that at the broad level, the networks are actually largely similar to each other across task and rest. So there is similar overall complexity between task and resting, and we see the similarity emerging at the specific subnetwork level as well. There is no significant differences between task and rest in any of the within or between network density measures. And what this could suggest is that the global architecture of these functional networks is relatively consistent or remains fairly stable across different scan conditions. However, when we take a look at the data from a more granular perspective, we do see some interesting patterns emerge. So one set of patterns that we do see has to do with the temporal dynamics of functional connectivity. So an interesting thing about GIMI is that it estimates both time-lagged as well as time-locked paths. So an example of time-lagged paths would be the autoregressive paths from the same ROI with like the activity from that ROI at t-1. And time-locked or contemporaneous patterns are more similar to what you would typically see in a functional connectivity matrix. And when we separate them out, we see that the faces task elicit more of that contemporaneous connection that's shown up on the top right here, whereas the resting state elicits more of that slower dynamic time-lagged paths compared with faces. And in these graphs, the thicker lines that you're seeing on the graphs here, mouse, are the group averages, whereas the thinner lines are individual data points. So there does seem to be some differences in terms of how the temporal dynamics are being captured by task and resting state data. We also see some differences emerge at the node level. but only limited to the bilateral IPL or inferior parietal lobule in the DMN network, which has been linked with integration of sensory information, emotion processing, which could make sense for why we're seeing the differences here. But I will note that the direction of left and right IPL, that in terms of the differences are they're in like the opposite directions. Not really sure what to make of that, but just. All right, so at a more subject-specific level, you might have already noticed something interesting, which is that there's a lot of individual differences in the data. So we have a lot of participants where their faces, what is this, salience network density, may be greater than resting, but we also have a lot of people where their patterns are showing up in the exact opposite direction. So does this individual differences or heterogeneity mean anything? So I tried to quantify this with a very simple difference score for each of the metrics that we had by subtracting the resting metric from the faces one. So essentially what this difference score means is that a more positive difference score is when the faces metric has greater value than the resting one, and a more negative one is when the resting has a greater value than faces. And then I looked at if they are meaningfully associated with mental health outcome, and specifically, I was interested in looking at depression outcomes in this study. So what I found is that the individual differences in functional connectivity is correlated with the teen's self-report depression score, which is something that I was really hoping to see given the implications of the model. And specifically what we see is that a greater self-report depression score here on the x-axis is associated with a lower difference score, particularly for the salience network density. And this result here is adjusting for head motion as well as age and sex. So what does this mean, right? As it turns out, this result with the difference score is driven by both a decrease in faces in the task-based salience network density, as well as an increase in the resting salience network density. And what this may suggest is that individuals with higher depression symptoms or self-report depression symptoms would show blunted salience network responsivity to emotional faces, as well as this elevated baseline responsivity during resting. And this result really helps showcase the individual differences in how connectivity patterns are being expressed in task and rest, and that has significant implications for how we can understand the brain's association with mental health outcome. So going back to that original question of yes or no, resting and task capture the same connectivity patterns, our results shows that it seems like it's a mix of both perspectives. At the group level, the functional networks do remain fairly similar across task and rest, but we do see some small differences that emerge. Notably, there are also a ton of individual differences in connectivity patterns across task and rest, and that seems to have important implications for mental health outcomes. And with that, so what's next, right? So in the short term, I'm obviously looking to wrap up my dissertation work. And for the third chapter of my dissertation, I'm diving into the functional correlates of EEA with a connectome-based connectivity modeling method and investigating how these connectivity patterns may be shaped by the environmental context. And in the longer term, as I look towards postdoctoral work, I'm excited to continue exploring kind of the same broad topic of looking at how contextual factors may shape neurocognitive development pathways longitudinally and the associations with mental health outcomes. I'm especially interested in diving more into computational modeling, into specific cognitive processes, such as learning and decision-making, and exploring the links with early experiences and later outcomes. I also look forward to finding various ways to understanding the neural underpinnings of cognition, as well as expanding beyond my current kind of functional connectivity network-based approach, and integrating the impact of other biological mechanisms such as puberty and hormones. And more broadly, I hope to continue and better understand the mechanisms that may drive developmental change over time and support cognitive development, and finding various ways to expand upon my methods and contents training in graduate schools. And I look forward to hearing your questions and feedbacks and continue to grow in this area and hopefully contributing to the innovative research that is happening here. And with that, I want to thank our study participants, my committee members and collaborators and staff and everyone who runs the study. And thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take some
questions. Can you remind me what EEA stands for?
The efficiency of evidence.
Okay. So why are you not just using drift rate?
So that is a great question. So we are.
Okay.
Right. I framed it as EEA in this study because I'm essentially kind of borrowing that conceptual framework that was developed by Alex Weigard,
okay.
Where EEA is more of this latent factor that kind of drives drift rate or performance across different tasks. So for this particular study, I am essentially just using drift rate. It is just one task that we had. It's the only task we have that's really amenable to this type of modeling. But there are other studies out there that have essentially, like, for example, in the APCD study, there's like a variety of cognitive tasks that is amenable to the DDM, and what they would do is essentially model those separately and then actually do like a lead factor approach, so that there's like a task general EEA and also task specific variances, and that is for actual EEA than what this is. But yes.
Okay. Thank you.
So do you have any measures of sleep quality and stress? And to what extent do you think they may mediate the relationships?
That's a great question. So we do have measures of sleep. We have self-report like sleep quality, I think, in the study. Nothing really beyond that. I did have we had a summer student like a little while ago that did look at the relationship with EA and sleep quality. We didn't see any significant associations there, but I would imagine that if you didn't, if your sleep quality is poor, that obviously has an impact on your executive functioning and your ability to effectively integrate information, etc. So I could definitely see a link there. What was your other measure?
You hear about kids that turn up in their classrooms, who come from deprived backgrounds 100%. And families, and
yes,
they're falling asleep in class.
100%. Yeah, I can definitely see that there's like a underlying potential mechanism there, and the reason why we may not have seen any significant associations within our particular set of adolescents, there could be multiples, right? Like it could be that their self-report measures are not as accurate as if you would actually have some kind of biometric measure of their sleep quality overnight, like the Oura ring or something like that. It could also be that I believe our scans are done at various times in the day, right? It's not always like in the morning or always in the afternoon, so that could also have an impact on how awake they are when they complete a task, and all of that. So,
and I was thinking more of your first set of studies.
Yeah, for sure. There were many. I don't know what's first. Sorry.
So I have a question about your game. Okay. I don't know too much about it, but from a search I saw that it's emotional. Usually emotional activity
Yes.
Directional, so you can talk, interpret it at
Directionality. Yeah, that is a great question. So we didn't look at directionality in this particular study, and part of that really has to do with we have a fairly limited sample size, and there were already a lot of measures that I wanted to compare, and so we didn't really expand beyond that. I do think that it would definitely be very interesting to look at directionality as well and really be able to parse out some of those, like for example, with the centrality measures the node centrality measures that we have, right? Like it's concatenating paths that are going in and out of the same ROI together. So what would it look like if we separate those? I do think that there is some caution against like looking at the paths like on a path by path basis, right? Gimme is obviously one of the advantages is that it is person specific, but also at the same time, because it is fitting very person specific models, it is highly susceptible to outside influences like head motion, for example. That is like a big factor, right? So if you can imagine that if somebody had like head motion, that might impact the paths on like a very specific path by path basis. So I think typically, at least in like the studies that we do in the lab, we don't really look at like directionality or like specific like weights of the paths, but more so just look at the network at the broad level, if that makes sense. There is weights.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you can-
Yeah, it's not average weights. So in Gimme, it's estimated like there are direction of the path. So like a path coming from like region 1 to region 2 and region 2 to region 1 are estimated separately, and they would have separate weights. But yeah, in my study, when I compute those measures, I do use them as like binary yes or no if they exist.
Thanks for talking. I got one question for each.
Sure, yeah.
So in the first half, I think implicit in the argument is the idea that things that are happening are affecting behavior and cognitive.
Yes.
So, especially for the relationship between adolescent neighborhood disadvantage and measure,
Yeah.
young adult,
Yeah.
homeless. Like, I'm wondering, to what extent do you think that's a consequence of accelerated change as a function of disadvantage versus something that is pre-established that's between subjects and just maintains? You understand that distinction?
Yes. So essentially, you're asking about if the higher EA that we see at young adulthood is because there is like accelerated.
Well,
Or is
do
it?
you think it's because they just have higher CTA for adolescents as well?
That is a great question. I think conceptually, I can see it as either way. Like I can imagine like if you lived in a better or well-resourced neighborhood in adolescence, that can help you improve your cognitive efficiency. So that would be like your first, right? Like it's a higher rate of increase. I can also see it where, so the thing is our participants, I don't think they moved around a lot. So I think that at least in our study, it could really be a contribution of those factors. Like, and there's not really a great way to tease it out because they tend to stay within like the same census tract, at least, right?
Yeah, so mobility definitely adds another huge element. to
Yeah.
this, but I think, the implications are very different, right? So if it's the case that having early childhood adversity leads to delayed cognitive development,
Yeah.
or non-ideal development, That's a different interpretation than
Mhm.
being raised beyond, in a certain environment, having certain cognitive repertoire, it's not going to lead to any changes.
Mm.
It's like it's the difference between like interpreting intercept versus slope.
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, like conceptually, I can see it being either way, and methodologically, but at least within our sample, I don't know if that's something that we could test, but I think that's certainly a very interesting direction that people should
You might have in your adolescence, so like in that second study,
Mhm.
community-based measurements from adolescence, right?
Yes.
So do you have EPA scores in those?
Yes, that was from the very first study. Yeah, and there is actually you have a good point. There is a subset of the sample that participated both in the adolescent wave and also at the young adult wave. So I could theoretically look at. Yeah, definitely.
Are they changing?
Are they? Yeah. If they were high at adolescence and then maybe they just stayed high. Yeah. That's a really good point. I should test that.
I guess, related to the second half.
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of echo the comment. I think it's the directionality is very challenging.
Yeah.
I've read it as well, so much for.
Yeah.
But I think more generally, I think everything you presented was related to essentially summary measures of like the density of the network.
Mhm.
Looked at any topological differences, like so you could have the same density across towns, but it might be a consequence of very different sets of connections.
Yes.
And you guys, I mean, heuristically you show it here, right? These things, but have you quantified that feature as a consequence?
That is a great question. I think that is definitely a limitation in this study. I think at the most, what is the word, like granular level of the analyses, we're looking at like node level connections, which I think does reveal some of those like more nuanced differences. But beyond that, like we're not looking at any of the other like, what is it, like small worldness or whatever other kind of measure.
I mean, those it would be the same challenge, right? Even like
Yeah.
even the node level, like you could have the same node level metric as a summary.
Yes,
But it might be a
100%.
very different node is
100%.
participating, right?
Yes.
So I think my question is mainly rather than looking at like the overall measure, you start thinking about what is the actual sets.
Yeah, I think that's definitely, I have
else?
thought about that.
All
But I
right, great.
think
Well,
with
let's give
the
another
Gimme
round of
method
applause.
in particular, we run into that same issue that I was talking about earlier, where like if we go down to like path by path level analysis, they are very sensitive to things like head motion, and so it's like people caution against looking at that. So I don't know if there is a better way to parse those things out. We could look at something like, and I've thought about doing this, but I haven't done it yet. We could look at like essentially like the difference like between the two networks, and like by difference I mean like not like with like an MLM kind of thing, but like literally subtracting, and then you see like which paths are existing in this one and which paths are existing in that one. But I think part of that still is constrained by, the sensitivity of Gimme to outside factors. But I think that is definitely something that's very interesting, and I would love to hear suggestions of like how we can better parse these things out for sure. Yes.
I agree. For the first experiment we're doing a bunch material hardship for in adolescence, really. There's an ability here with trajectory.
Yeah, there is. Yes, great question. There is definitely trajectory. Now I am regretting not putting the details of the growth curve in my slides. They're definitely correlated. We do have the slope for the growth curve was significant in the positive direction, so it seems like there was like a small increase to material hardship level over time. But in terms of like like if we just look at like the base correlations between those values, they are pretty highly correlated. I can't tell you, sorry. But yeah, so that's why I think it's interesting that we didn't see any significant association between slope, the rate of change, and EA. But also like the increase is like fairly small. Like I think it's less than like 1 unit of material hardship scores. So it does seem like some participants are experiencing like significantly more poverty as time goes on, but also most people are like staying within their same range, if that makes sense.
I was wondering if earlier childhood
Yeah.
or effects on today, but if they're pretty similar, like pretty like significantly correlated.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, it is definitely, I tried to get like specific developmental timing. But like you said, they are like correlated with each other to a degree. And so it was like hard to get the significant variance. So I tried to do that by just putting the scores from each of the ages into the same model. And nothing was significant anymore. And I also tried, there's this like other more complicated method that this was like after the manuscript had already been submitted, and I was like, oh, just out of curiosity, like how can we parse out the developmental timing more? There's this other method called SLICMA that is, I can't quite get into the details right now, but that does like, it essentially tests different hypotheses to pick out like, is it developmental timing, is it earlier timing, or is it cumulative, or is it like recency effects? And we didn't see any significant results coming out of that either. So it didn't seem like that earlier childhood, or there was like a sensitive period type of thing. But that is definitely very interesting. So, yeah, thank you.
We're just at time, and so if no one else has a question, I'm going to prone to stay on schedule, and let's thank Linda and give her another round of applause.